If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. There's no doubt that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture.
They even helped to carry the desks in.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
In order to eliminate the threat to the peace in Palestine, an armistice shall be established in all sectors.
An armistice agreement has been entered into between the United Nations Command and the commanders of the communist forces in Korea.
For the first time in the world's history, a permanent international body to deal exclusively with the problems of non-self-governing peoples.
We will be even prouder when we can leave the Congo solely and fully in the good hands of its own people.
Dag Hammarskjöld is dead, but the United Nations lives.
We've seen a return to democracy in many countries.
I hereby certify that the electoral process in Namibia has been free and fair.
The dawn of a new era.
I therefore have the honor to declare the Republic of Namibia membership in the United Nations.
I think the major contributor to the success of the action of the Haitian people decided to come out and to vote to decide on their own destiny.
The people of Mozambique who once again proved their commitment to democracy and a strong will to live in peace and harmony.
The Treaty for the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It is the most important international agreement in the field of disarmament since the nuclear age began.
We should not confuse the signing of agreements with the solving of problems.
Much work remains to be done, but the significant progress represents real successful diplomacy.
United Nations Peacekeeping Forces received the Nobel Peace Prize for 1988.
Peacekeeping operations symbolizes the world community's will to peace.
The creation of a UN peacekeeping force for Cyprus could only come about by positive action of this Council.
The protection of civilians is at the center of the United Nations peace and security agenda.
The first session of the International Tribunal for serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the former Yugoslavia.
We have 113 trucks a day. At the same time, it is not like going through Fifth Avenue. We have to negotiate with checkpoints everywhere in order to make sure that we reach the people.
We're starting with no government, no civil services. Nothing remains in Somalia except some spirit and some hope.
I need your assistance so that I will be able to convince the member state to continue to offer the humanitarian assistance.
The right of life, the right to be free from torture and physical maltreatment, a lack of fair trial, limitations on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement.
I am here to listen to you. I am here to learn. Tell me, frankly, how you believe the United Nations, myself and my colleagues can be helpful to you.
Minutes ago, an explosion went through a hotel in central Baghdad, the headquarters for the UN.
The UN and the international community here have been simply stunned by what's happened. Officials are saying they believe it was a suicide attack.
100 people are wounded and 22 killed.
Today we share our shock and sorrow at the loss of people we loved.
Democracy, which everybody is striving for, is really a rather meaningless phrase if people don't have enough to eat.
The international economic situation has become harsh and unfavorable for all developing countries, especially Africa.
Realizing every person's rights to food is a moral and humanitarian imperative. Hunger is a stain on humanity. We are working together as a movement to tackle hunger now and in the future.
The humanitarian case is clear. We know that it will be the world's
poorest citizens who will be hardest hit by climate change.
I believe that mankind has looked at climate change as if it were a fiction. Every week we're seeing evidence that accelerated climate change is here right now. None of this is hysteria, it is fact.
And I'm beginning to wonder how many more alarm bells must go off before the world rises to the challenge. Only courageous leadership will make the goals of Paris a reality.
Behind every refugee, behind every migrant, there is a family, there is skills, knowledge, there is a story, and above all, I would say, incredible resilience.
I would like to pay my tribute to all who were far-sighted enough to insert an article in the Charter covering the principle of equality between men and women.
It is the first intergovernmental meeting in the world where women form part of virtually every delegation.
Even in their oppression, women in South Africa can never be equal to their men.
Let us remember those women who, during the early years of the United Nations, kept alive the flame of women's issues at a time when it was not the accepted subject it is today.
We want to end gender inequality, and we don't just want to talk about it. We want to try and make sure that it's tangible.
Unless you disperse immediately, I shall have to use force.
It will forever remain an indelible blight on human history that the apartheid crime ever occurred. It will forever remain an accusation and a challenge to all men and women of conscience that it took as long as it has before all of us stood up to say enough is enough.
Each lantern represents the hope we have for our future because of the commitments you have made to the global goals.
A renewal of commitment by leader after leader. This is absolutely critical to respond to challenges that affect all countries. Poverty, gross inequalities, discrimination against women and girls, climate change, and a rapidly deteriorating natural environment. We are off track. Let's make it a turning point for people and for planet, and deliver a decade of action in achieving the SDGs.
If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
Today's United Nations does more than ever before. It does it better than ever before. Yet, our work is far from complete. Indeed, it will never be.
Excellencies, global citizens, thank you for joining us online to commemorate the signing of the Charter of the United Nations. Today's event is open to all, and I encourage you to interact with our panels to discuss the principles and relevance of the UN Charter, the increased need for international cooperation, and Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. This event takes place as many people suffer and bear great losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we draw strength from those who have persevered in the past in the face of great despair. This includes the penholders of the UN Charter who dared to imagine a better world defined by peace and equality. On June 26, 1945, leaders gathered in San Francisco to sign the Charter of the United Nations, thereby establishing an international organization of unrivaled reach and legitimacy with a new rules-based world order at its core. Thus, the United Nations was created to, among other things, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Today, 75 years on, we'll hear from each regional group of the UN and from the principals of its main organs. The General Assembly is the primary deliberative, policy-making, and representative body of the United Nations, a parliament of humanity based upon equality of voice and vote. It's a forum to share perspectives, forge partnerships, and build consensus. The Assembly provides a space where members can generate understanding and reach compromise. General Assembly resolutions reflect the aspirations of humanity, paving way for the normative development of international law with far-reaching ramifications across a wide range of issues affecting the people we serve. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by a GA resolution in 1948. The Paris Climate Agreement, a feat of multilateralism, began in embryonic form as a General Assembly resolution. At the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, the Assembly adopted a resolution on the most authoritative and comprehensive formulation of the principle of self-determination. We continue to promote equality and dignity for all, including through the GA-mandated International Decade of Recognition, Justice and Development for People of African Descent. At the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, member states adopted GA resolutions which call for solidarity and global access to medicines and medical equipment. Currently, there is an omnibus resolution under negotiation to address all aspects of our response to the pandemic. The membership has taken historic steps to enable the UN to operate during this period by adopting decisions under silence procedure. Intergovernmental negotiations on the declaration for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations continued throughout this period. This has ensured business continuity as we herald the beginning of the decade of action and delivery to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, the membership of the General Assembly pledged to leave no one behind and shift the world onto a path of sustainable development and prosperity for all. Now we must fulfill our commitments to finance sustainable development and engage business leaders to align with the principles for responsible business of the UN Global Compact. As we work toward the future we want and the UN we need, we must be results-focused. Now, more than ever, we need a strong UN development system and effective collaboration between the UN and international financial institutions. In pursuit of inclusive multilateralism, we must continue to create space for civil society and ensure the full participation of voices that have gone unheard for too long, those of women, youth, indigenous persons, and people with disabilities. This is a moment of reckoning for our shared planet and shared future. This is a time for action, ambition, and partnership. 3/4 of a century ago, skeptics doubted the resolve of the members of the United Nations. Cynicism did not prevail then, nor will it now. We, the peoples, remain nations united, guided by the principles of our charter. I thank you.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, I send my warmest greetings to we the peoples. Those first 3 words of our founding charter, adopted 75 years ago today, give the United Nations its vision and its mission. We exist to serve people, and we work as one for the benefit of all. The Charter was adopted as the Second World War was in its final months and winding down. We mark the anniversary of that milestone as global pressures are spiraling up. The Charter brought rules and hope to a world in ruins. It remains our touchstone for a world mired in a pandemic, torn by discrimination, endangered by climate change, and scared by poverty, inequality, and war. Agreement on the Charter closed one era and opened another. Gone were the genocidal Nazi regime and their allies. In came the prospect of human rights. Out went rampant nationalism and precarious balance of power that produced 2 catastrophic world wars. In came the promise of collective security and the peaceful resolution of disputes. And where an earliest attempt at international organization dissolved, the new United Nations started life on firmer ground, built on norms and the lessons of hard experience. The post-war multilateral arrangements have compiled a solid record of service, saving millions of lives, advancing the human condition, and fulfilling its cardinal task of preventing World War III. but there have been painful setbacks, and today's realities are as forbidding as ever. COVID-19 has touched everyone, everywhere, precisely the kind of global challenge for which the United Nations was founded. At the same time, people continue to lose trust in political establishments. Today's marches against racism were preceded by widespread protests against inequality, discrimination, corruption, and lack of opportunities all over the world, grievances that still need to be addressed, including with a renewed social contract. Meanwhile, other fundamental fragilities have only grown. The climate crisis, environmental degradation, cyber attacks, nuclear proliferation, a pushback on human rights, and the risk of another pandemic. It's not difficult to imagine a new virus transmitted as easily as COVID-19, but as deadly as Ebola. The delegates in San Francisco in 1945, having themselves lived through a global pandemic, depression and war, seized their opportunity to plant the seeds of something better and new. Today, we must do the same. To achieve that watershed moment, we need to reimagine multilateralism, give it teeth to function as the founders intended, and ensure that effective global governance is a reality when it is needed. We must also bring others to the table in an inclusive and networked multilateralism, since governments are only part of today's political realities. Civil society, cities, the private sector, and young people are essential voices in shaping the world we want. Like those who drafted the Charter, we must look without illusion at today's injustices, their roots, and the suffering they engender. Yet, there is also much to encourage us and drive us onward. The heroism and solidarity of the pandemic response, the global embrace of the Sustainable Development Goals, the millions of young activists and global citizens pushing to advance equality, climate action, a green economy, and to take control of their destiny. I'm inspired by so much that has been built and achieved across 75 years. I pay tribute to the service and sacrifice of thousands of United Nations peacekeepers, staff, and others who across the world and across the years gave their lives while advancing the causes and values of the United Nations. The Charter's vision stands the test of time, and its values will continue to carry us forward. Now is the time to persevere, press ahead, pursue our goals, show responsibility for our world, and take care of each other. It is up to us to rise to the test of this pivotal moment for our future. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Security Council in my capacity of President of the Security Council. 75 years ago, the Charter of the United Nations was signed in San Francisco. On that day, we, the peoples of the United Nations, reaffirmed our determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime had brought untold sorrow to mankind. The UN Charter is a cornerstone of multilateralism. In this UN Charter Day, the best way to commemorate is to reaffirm the spirit of the Charter and to recommit ourselves to the founding aspiration of the United Nations. Today, the Security Council reaffirms its commitment to the Charter of the United Nations, including to the purposes and principles of the Charter and to an international order based on international law, which is the indispensable foundation of a more peaceful, prosperous and just world, for peaceful coexistence and for cooperation among states in addressing threats to international peace and security. In this connection, the Council reaffirms its commitment to multilateralism and to the central role of the United Nations. The Security Council reaffirms its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security under the Charter of the United Nations, and in this context, it underscores the need for all states and international and regional organizations and others to have respect for the Charter. Mr. President, over the last 75 years, the United Nations has significantly contributed to the preventing and solving of conflicts and to reducing the humanitarian damages of armed conflicts. Building on the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, we have collectively strived towards a more peaceful and inclusive world, including through the Women, Peace and Security and Children and Armed Conflicts agendas. We are currently deploying 26 special political missions and other political presences, as well as 110,000 peacekeepers across 13 peace operations throughout the world. We wish to pay tribute to the women and to the men who have contributed to our collective efforts for the maintenance of international peace and security, and in particular to the 3,928 peacekeepers and other United Nations employees who have made the ultimate sacrifice while completing their mission. We support the reforms initiated by the Secretary-General to ensure that peacekeeping is fit, accountable and performing at the highest levels to meet the challenges of the 21st century, and that the safety and security of peacekeepers is improved. However, there are areas where success has not been achieved. Since 1945, no continent has been spared by wars and crises, and today still, too many ongoing armed conflicts are destroying lives and livelihoods and displacing women, men and children all over the world. At least 70 million people have been forced to flee their homes, including around 26 million refugees. Violations and abuses of international human rights and violations of international humanitarian law are still too widespread. Many UN-designated terrorist groups remain active, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction remains a threat for international peace and security, while emerging threats are posing new challenges. People around the world are suffering from the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. This massive challenge necessitates a strong multilateral system and more cooperation and solidarity among nations, not less. In this regard, we commend the Secretary General's leadership in coordinating the UN system to fight the pandemic and to prepare for recovery, and we can welcome his call for a global ceasefire. Mr. President, in the years to come, we need to build on our collective achievements and learn from our shortcomings in order to live up to the promises of the founders of the United Nations. Building on the reform undertaken by the Secretary-General and the 2030 Agenda, we need to promote and improve the peaceful resolution of conflicts, as well as the prevention of conflicts, peace building and post-conflict recovery. And we must underscore that sustainable development, human rights, peace and security are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. We also need to better involve youth in our endeavours, who have already shown their leadership in addressing today's challenges. In this endeavour, I would underline the importance of the role of regional and sub-regional organisations and arrangements of cooperation with them, consistent with Chapter 8 of the Charter of the United Nations, with regard to maintaining international peace and security, contributing to international efforts to uphold the Charter. The task is immense, but let me assure you that the Security Council remains determined to do its part and to fulfil its mandate in an effective, inclusive and transparent manner. In this regard, the Security Council stresses its determination to uphold the Charter of the United Nations in all of its activities, and its commitment to work closely with all relevant partners to ensure more effective implementation of the Charter as an indispensable tool in the maintenance of international peace and security. To conclude, allow me to quote the first President of the Security Council, since his words remain true: "The maintenance of peace requires the cooperation of all members of the United Nations. That cooperation rests in the ultimate issue on the will of the peoples of the world to work for peace. A real will for peace must not spring from fear, but from positive faith in the brotherhood of man, and I would add, the sisterhood of women." I thank you.
Excellencies, the 50 signatories of the UN Charter had a bold vision for our world. By joining the United Nations, we have all pledged to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. I feel privileged to be presiding over one of the principal organs of the UN, the Economic and Social Council, which stands at the center of this aspiration. The UN Charter vested a powerful mandate in ECOSOC to foster international cooperation on economic, social, and cultural issues, and to promote universal respect and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction to race, sex, language, or religion. Today, the world is shifting beneath our feet. The COVID-19 pandemic is a wake-up call for us to strengthen global collaboration. We can only succeed through a coordinated multilateral response, strong political leadership, and global solidarity with those most vulnerable. This is what the Sustainable Development Goals, the global blueprint to end poverty, protect our planet, and ensure prosperity are all about. We must not and cannot relent on our commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, even amid this painful pandemic. In its 75th years, ECOSOC has proven its ability to effectively respond to global emergency. It has created UNAIDS in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the ad hoc advisory group on African countries emerging from conflict, a precursor to the Peacebuilding Commission. And ECOSOC has been instrumental in putting women at the heart of development efforts. The Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, was one of the first functional commissions created within ECOSOC. The Council has also contributed to establishing global norms and standards, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was the product of the UN Commission on Human Rights, established by ECOSOC. Guided by the first words of the UN Charter, we, the peoples of the United Nations, ECOSOC has a unique convening power, bringing together valuable constituencies such as youth and the private sector to contribute to our work and discussions. And ECOSOC has been the gateway for civil society organizations to engage with the UN. Today, more than 5,000 NGOs are enriching our work. Excellency, it is my pledge to continue engaging with all of you to ensure that ECOSOC remains as relevant today as in the future, as it was first envisioned in the Charter 75 years ago. Even in troubling times, there remains great hope in the power of working together. That is the founding spirit of the United Nations and the promise of the UN Charter. And in this anniversary year, as we face grave and global challenges, it is the spirit we must summon today. Thank you.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in the celebrations commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Charter of the United Nations. The instrument we celebrate today is the most innovative and trailblazing treaty in the history of international relations. It laid down the foundations of the rule of law at the international level already 75 years ago. It banned the use of force in international relations. It established the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples all over the world. It imposed on all states an obligation to settle their disputes peacefully. Of course, all the provisions of the Charter are relevant to the work of the International Court of Justice. But two of its chapters relate directly to the mission of the court. That is to say, the peaceful settlement of interstate disputes. These are Chapter 6 concerning the Pacific settlement of disputes in general, and Chapter 14 entitled the International Court of Justice, together with the Statute of the Court, which is annexed to the Charter. Chapter 6 of the Charter establishes a multilateral framework for the peaceful settlement of disputes. It sets out the methods to be used to settle such disputes, which include the judicial settlement of disputes. It is of particular significance because Article 36 of that chapter calls upon the Security Council, when making recommendations on the settlement of international disputes, and I quote, to take into consideration that legal disputes should, as a general rule, be referred by the parties to the International Court of Justice in accordance with the provisions of the Statute of the Court. Chapter 14 of the Charter establishes the Court as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and provides that the Statute of the Court forms an integral part of the Charter. This distinguishes our court from its predecessor, the Permanent Court of International Justice. Thus, in the case of our court, all members of the United Nations are automatically parties to its statute. The provisions of the Charter dealing with the International Court of Justice were the very first which received the full approval of a plenary commission and of the conference in San Francisco. For the president of Commission 4 of the conference, the adoption of these provisions before any others was encouraging because, in his words, and I quote, "No peace and no true fraternity could be reached among the peoples of the earth unless it was based upon that justice of which the court is the very symbol." These provisions presented to a war-stricken world the beacons of justice and law and offered to participating states the possibility of substituting orderly judicial processes for the vicissitudes of war and the reign of brutal force. Those orderly judicial processes have now taken root in international relations. Since 1945, the court has been seized by states in 151 contentious cases. It has also delivered 28 advisory opinions. 74 states have accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the court. At the same time, more than 300 treaties refer to the court's jurisdiction for the settlement of disputes relating to their interpretation and application. At present, Mr. President, 17 cases are pending before the court involving 28 states from all 5 UN regional groups. This widespread acceptance by states of the judicial settlement of disputes by the court is due to the quality of its work over the last 7.5 decades. The court has broken new ground in its jurisprudence on territorial and boundary disputes, maritime delimitation, diplomatic and consular relations, and the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. At the same time, it stands at the forefront of the settlement of disputes relating to contemporary challenges on the protection of human rights and the environment. To conclude, Mr. President, let me recall the words of the Special Rapporteur of Committee 4.1 of the San Francisco Conference, Mr. Nasrat El-Farsi of Iraq, and I quote, "We are here endeavoring to establish an international court of justice on firmer ground. Let us pray that this court will succeed in holding aloft the sun of justice to enlighten all the nations of the world without distinction and wherever they may be on the face of the globe. End of quotation. 75 years later, the court is still spreading the bright rays of the sun of justice and of the rule of law throughout the world, and offering all states the possibility of settling disputes peacefully through the law instead of resorting to brutal force. I thank you, Mr. President, and members of the Assembly for your attention.
President of the UN General Assembly, Excellencies and dear colleagues, distinguished delegates, as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, I have the honor to convey this message on behalf of the Africa Group as the chair of the month of June 2020. At the outset, I would want to thank His Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Professor Tijani Mohammed Bande, and your team in the office of the PGA for organizing this very important event. Certainly, the 75th anniversary is a cause for celebration of the member states' success in implementing the UN Charter, and also a moment to reflect on where we have fallen short. Indeed, the UN, a formation of the Charter, has over the past 75 years provided a platform through which differences of opinion or otherwise are resolved around the table rather than in the battlefield. In addition to conflict prevention, peace building, and peacekeeping, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is another milestone that the member states must be happy about. Collectively, in pursuit of the UN Charter values, in particular, the ideal of promoting social progress and better standards of life. Regrettably, however, the existence of the Charter alone is not enough. The Charter has not stopped outbreaks of armed conflicts in different parts of the world in the past 75 years. The period has seen marked prevalence of endemic poverty and disease. As a result, we still have a lot of work to do in upholding the letter and spirit of the UN Charter. In this connection, I wish to give assurance of the Africa Group member states that we are fully committed to the Charter, and we are striving to uphold its ideals through, among others, measures to pursue the SDGs, and we are working towards silencing the guns of which our region has deliberately set itself a very ambitious target of achieving that objective by 2020. We therefore encourage all the member states to continue to protect, to preserve, and to promote the sanctity of the UN Charter. In this regard, this anniversary should re-energize us in our ongoing intergovernmental efforts that are aimed at enhancing responsiveness, accountability, and efficiency, and inclusiveness of the principal organs of the UN, especially the reforms of the UN Security Council. This anniversary should also renew our commitment to multilateralism as an indispensable tool for addressing threats to international peace and security, promoting human rights, and combating poverty and disease. I want to thank you for your kind attention on behalf of the Africa Group, and I wish everyone well as we combat the pandemic, COVID-19, and as we respond to its devastating socio-economic implications. We are confident that will emerge stronger and united and even more resilient as we rebuild back better and together. I thank you for your attention.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, it's my honor to speak on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group. Today is the Charter Day, a golden opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter, the United Nations, and multilateralism. 75 years ago, 50 member states gathered in San Francisco and signed the Charter, ushered in a brand new chapter in human history. Since then, the Charter has been the universally accepted international instrument. It's a cornerstone of the rule of law and multilateralism. It established the basic norms governing international relations. It developed widely recognized principles of international law. The principles of sovereign equality, peaceful resolution of international disputes, respect for territorial integrity and political independence, non-interference in the internal affairs, as well as equal rights and self-determination of peoples, have taken deep root in our hearts and minds and have contributed significantly to achieving the purposes of the United Nations, promoting world peace, development, and human rights. Mr. President, we member states of Asia-Pacific Group are beneficiaries of the Charter. With a functioning UN and a multilateral system based on the Charter, the Asia-Pacific region has enjoyed the benefit of peace and security, created a conducive environment for development, and as a result, the region has turned itself into an engine of global economy. We are contributors of the Charter. We firmly adhere to the four purposes and the 7 principles, fulfill in good faith the obligations we assumed, abide by international law anchored on the Charter. The 10 principles of Bandung, agreed at the Afro-Asian Conference in 1955, further developed and enriched the Charter spirit. We are defenders of the Charter. The COVID-19 pandemic further demonstrates the importance of multilateralism. We should remain committed in intensifying international solidarity and cooperation, supporting the UN at the core of the international system. Mr. President, COVID-19 once again reminds us that we are closely interconnected and we are only as strong as the weakest. What the world needs now is solidarity and cooperation. Only with that can we defeat the virus and build back better. In the spirit of the world as one community, let us join hands and work tirelessly for the future we want, the United Nations we need. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. 75 years ago, mankind learned a bitter lesson from the horrors of the Second World War. Speaking on behalf of the Eastern European group, I cannot stress enough what an extreme level of destruction and suffering this conflict inflicted to our part of the world. Still, the sacrifice of those who perished in World War II was not in vain, as the tragic experience of the war led to the creation of a new global organization to maintain peace through multilateral engagement of all nations. Unfortunately, the world has not been free from war for the last 75 years. However, more conflicts would undoubtedly have spread, and the toll of death and the flood of homeless would definitely have been much greater without the UN. The UN has given us an institutional framework for managing both acute crises and chronic problems. It provides a forum where the voice of any member country, however small, can be heard. The United Nations has also shown that it is a force for the action. It can help to keep the peace by setting the stage for negotiation, by acting as the catalyst which persuades those in dispute to prefer negotiation to confrontation, and, if needed, by pursuing its peacekeeping role through military means. There is no substitute for the unique legitimacy provided by the United Nations in this respect. The work of the United Nations and its achievements throughout its history are extraordinary. It has not only helped to prevent many conflicts, but also provided food and medical assistance in emergencies and offered humanitarian support to millions of people around the world. Since its inception, the United Nations has performed and coordinated numerous humanitarian, environmental, and peacekeeping operations, including providing food to millions of people, assisting refugees, authorizing more than 70 international peacekeeping missions, helping about 50 countries per year with their elections, providing vaccinations, protecting human rights, building nations. Today, the world is facing new challenges. It is obvious that many problems of our time are beyond the capacity of any single nation to resolve on its own. To deal with them, we have to become more internationalized, more open, and more flexible to take advantage of the opportunities offered by establishing close relationships around the world. We must reaffirm UN role and authority to take up global issues and demonstrate the political will to establish broad international understanding on a joint way forward. The 75th anniversary of the UN should not be merely a celebratory event, but it should also provide an occasion for a recommitment to the purposes and principles laid down in the Charter of the United Nations. Time has shown that multilateral approach is more efficient in coping with global or regional problems. The more we respect the shared values as set in the Charter and accept obligations and restraints, the more we will be able to tackle new challenges that we face today. Therefore, the anniversary is an opportunity to give a new momentum to international cooperation and solidarity that the peoples of the world increasingly demand. It is also an opportunity to discuss how to do it better. I thank you.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the regional group of the Latin American and Caribbean states on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Charter of the United Nations. At this difficult juncture due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the United Nations remains one of mankind's main assets and a platform for its prosperity in all areas. 75 years ago, the United Nations founders enshrined into the Charter their hope and aspiration to save future generations from the scourge of war. All the principles of multilateralism are contained in the Charter. The countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, guided by their commitment to multilateralism, international law, and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, have been actively involved in this organization since its creation. They represent the regional group with the largest number of founding members and have made substantive contributions to the pillars of peace and security, development, and human rights. However, the challenges of today's world are more complex, as demonstrated by the devastating impacts of COVID-19, which is deemed to lead to an increase in poverty and the emergence of hotspots of conflict that in many cases have as root causes global phenomena such as growing inequality, the effects of climate change, the arms race, and transnational organized crime. To these we can add the continuation of unfinished processes such as decolonization that continues to affect Latin America and the Caribbean. The countries of Latin America and the Caribbean consider that in a world of increasing interdependence, the validity, development, and defense of a rules-based international order is essential.
and is the only way to effectively address global threats. Our multilateral vocation leads us to reaffirm, on this special date, our commitment to strengthen the global institutions and promote greater international cooperation and solidarity between countries within a framework of primacy of law and justice. We also welcome the UN 75 initiative of the Secretary General, which seeks to secure a more inclusive and transparent organization to respond to the great challenges of the future. We will also encourage the peaceful settlement of disputes as well as peacekeeping and peace building. Likewise, we will guide our capabilities and political will towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda, the universalization, full implementation, and respect of international instruments on disarmament and non-proliferation, a renewed commitment in the struggle against climate change, and the promotion and protection of human rights, gender equality, and the empowerment of women and girls. I'd like to convey the appreciation and support of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean to the staff of the United Nations for their professionalism and sense of duty. I would like to conclude by recalling Javier Pérez de Cuellar, a distinguished Latin American who had the high honor of being Secretary General of this House. I would like to invoke his memory as a pilgrim for peace to renew our commitment to a multilateralism that may make a better world for all. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the member states of the Western European and other states group. The United Nations Charter, forged from the ashes of the Second World War, has served us well as the legal foundation of our organization, enshrining the fundamental principles and values that drive multilateral cooperation and the rules-based international order. It symbolizes the shared hopes and aspirations of its founders to build a better future, promoting peace, universal human rights, equality, and development for all. The 75th anniversary of this great organization provides an opportunity to reflect on our past achievements. We have an overall positive story to tell. The United Nations has been a catalyst for human development and progress, multilateral cooperation, and international law, shaping the world as we know it and symbolizing the largest ever peace project. These achievements have been the work of the entire UN membership, the committed UN staff, not least UN peacekeepers, civil society, and the private sector. But there are still too many unfulfilled promises and disappointments mirrored in ongoing conflicts, refugee and humanitarian crises, climate change, as well as persistent poverty, inequalities, including gender disparities and social injustice. Mr. President, today we are in the midst of a global crisis that has no parallels in the last 75 years, causing death and severe illness with far-reaching humanitarian, social, and economic consequences that are not likely to disappear anytime soon. The pandemic is a stark reminder that global challenges call for a global response, openness, transparency, and respect for human rights. No state, large or small, can act in isolation. Let me thank the Secretary General for his leadership, calling for unity and solidarity, pressing for a global ceasefire, and mobilizing the United Nations in saving lives and preparing for recovery. We need to make sure that our organization continues to evolve in line with the Secretary General's reform agenda to stay fit for purpose and true to its core values and multilingualism. In the end, it falls on all of us to work in unison with the United Nations at the helm and build back better for a more equitable, resilient, and sustainable future. Agenda 2030 provides a robust blueprint for building a better future for all, addressing the needs and rights of human beings to realize their full potential in dignity and equality, safeguarding peace and prosperity, protecting our planet, and taking actions against climate change. This decade needs to be a true decade of action, accelerating the implementation of the SDGs, ensuring that future generations will be able to prosper, leaving no one behind. Mr. President, we should use this anniversary to raise awareness and encourage a broad, transparent dialogue on how we can further strengthen multilateralism and the United Nations, involving civil society, youth, and businesses, so we can together create the future we want and the UN we need. I thank you.
Mr. President, the United States joins with the international community today to commemorate the signing of the United Nations Charter. This is an appropriate moment for reflection on the aspirations of the international community when this document was signed, how far we have come since, and yet how far we have to go. In San Francisco during the summer of 1945, the United States was proud to sign the Charter as a founding member of the United Nations and to become its host country. 75 years on, we remain proud to have been among the Charter's original signatories. In the years since its founding, the UN has, at times, risen to the occasion, helping to mitigate conflicts and saving lives through peace building and humanitarian action. Despite these achievements, the UN has yet to realize its full potential. President Trump and I have spoken many times about the great potential of the United Nations. As member states, we deserve a United Nations that is professional, transparent, and rules-based. If we are to rely on UN institutions, they must be worthy of our trust and demonstrate that they are truly working for the common good. Multilateralism is not an end unto itself. Rather, it should be used as a tool for sovereign states to resolve conflict and promote peace and stability in the world. 75 years later, we must not stray from the UN's founding document. The ideals reflected in the Charter endure because they were built on principles that transcend our differences. Faith in fundamental freedoms and human rights, the dignity and worth of every person, and equal rights for all. Indeed, they were inspired by the principles that animate the founding documents of the United States. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to upholding those founding values and call on the UN to do the same. But we cannot merely profess this commitment to the Charter and its principles. We must each demonstrate it through action, stewardship, and accountability. That is why we will continue to focus our efforts on UN reform, integrity, and transparency. The global community deserves a United Nations that is efficient, fair, transparent, and rules-based in everything from its financial decisions to its elections for leadership positions in UN agencies to truly promote sustainable development. UN institutions that don't live up to this standard should be reformed or shuttered. The COVID-19 pandemic has tragically thrown into sharp focus the need for efficient, effective, and independent UN institutions. It has taught us that effective global responses to shared challenges, most especially public health crisis, require the free flow of information, transparency, and accountability. Whether in response to public health, international security, or humanitarian and development challenges, the United States has and will continue to lead in upholding the principles of the Charter. Mr. President, I want to close by expressing our gratitude to all of those who have sacrificed over the past 75 years to make the aims of the Charter the lived reality of our brothers and sisters around the globe. Among these individuals, none are more deserving of our admiration and thanks than those who have made the ultimate sacrifice and who put their own lives in danger on behalf of others in numerous missions, including peacekeeping missions. May this institution honor their memories by recommitting itself to the values they died to uphold. May God bless the United Nations. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
You ask me what I will inherit. You want the easy answer, the kind I would have given you as a child when the glass was half full and full of fairy tales. 3D printed hearts, primordial forests, cars made of sun, bodies on the moon. Back then, the possibilities were infinite. People fell in love over binary codes, slayed dragons with cardboard signs, held bursting galaxies in their hands, and gave them names of their own. If you'd asked me then what the human inheritance was, I might have said magic, or light, or everything in between. You ask me what I will inherit. I am 17 years old, coming of age, and I don't believe in fairy tales anymore.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture.
I have learned that physics is too cruel for bedtime stories, that the equal and opposite reaction forbids happy endings. See, for every 3D printed heart beating in a body, there is a bomb that will render it useless. For every forest that holds a universe and grows beyond measure, there is a fire that will burn it down. For every dragon who is slain, there is another who will take his place, and another, and another, and another.
But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
I have learned that we are too human for fairy tales. We build bridges and break them. We write books and burn them. We breathe life into names and bury them beyond our memory, conjugating death until it is thin enough to forget. I am 17 years old, and I have watched the world try to end 1,000 different times. You ask me what I will inherit, and
If we had had this charter a few years ago...
I am too scared to tell you what I already know.
And above all, the will to use it.
That this failure is hereditary.
Millions now dead would be alive.
That our blood cannot be washed clean. And if this is true, if our destiny is to be victims of entropy, then there are some things that I don't understand. Like why every time the darkness tries to rise, there is someone who tries to stop it. Like why every time we are given reason to retreat into ourselves, there is someone who extends a hand across the world. Don't they know that our evil cannot be killed, only renamed? Don't they know there is no cure to the flaws in our bloodline? How foolish it is to fight against our inheritance, foolish and futile and brave.
If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
You ask me what I will inherit. I'm 17 years old, and I have watched the world try to end 1,000 times and will watch us try to save it 1,000 more. Maybe there is something more to this human inheritance than darkness and entropy, failure and free fall, something you have to choose. A fight that never ends, a hope that always burns, a belief that our inheritance can be greater than the sum of its parts. Maybe we have been choosing this all along. I am not the first girl to come of age with the world mourning at her feet, and each time we stand over this abyss, it is a little brighter, a little warmer inside. So this is the inheritance I choose, this foolish hope, this endless fight, 1,000 hands reaching through darkness to offer their own little pieces of magic and light until someday, the next girl who stands here will see only stars.
As the United Nations celebrates its 75th anniversary this year, we the peoples have united to call our leaders to use this moment to strengthen, innovate, and rejuvenate our global governance system. To this end, UN 2020 has undertaken a global, multi-sectoral, cross-regional dialogue to develop a coherent civil society vision for a strengthened UN system. The outcome of this dialogue is reflected in the UN 75 People's Declaration and Plan of Action. This video will walk you through some of its most important messages.
At a time when change is progressing at a pace and scale unparalleled in human history, we can and must lay the foundation for a better path for humanity.
As the negative impacts of outdated national and global institutions, norms and values become ever more problematic. Humanity must respond as one people, united in vision while diverse in approach.
The health crisis, climate crisis, entrenched indignities such as social, gender, and race inequality, and the absence of sufficient coordination to end even preventable challenges.
Demonstrate the need for leadership characterized not by short-term victories, but by long-term vision and urgent action.
A paradigm of us versus them no longer meets our needs. We, the people, recognize the reality of global interdependence.
At the heart of the solution to today's challenges lies a sincere commitment to collaboration, innovation, and action.
The time has come to launch a rigorous, non-partisan, transparent, and inclusive process to assess global governance gaps and to develop a coherent strategy to fill them. We are asking global leaders and governments to
establish a post-2020 international mechanism to follow up examination of the global challenges we have and identify options to make the UN more fit for purposes.
Dedicate a civil society focal point at the Under-Secretary General level in the UN Secretariat. This position would bring deeper partnerships with civil society into the UN's work.
Take urgent climate action. The transition to net zero carbon economies brings opportunities to reduce poverty, inequality, biodiversity loss, and injustice.
Increase the funding of the United Nations. Shortage of funding undermines the effective actions of the UN.
We call for the creation of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly whose delegates would be directly elected by the people they represent.
Realizing the vision of the world we would like to see at the centenary of the United Nations and beyond requires bold and fundamental transformation of the present global system.
Let future generations look back on 2020 as the year when a threatened humanity determined with one voice to shed harmful legacies and move towards a shared future of dignity and hope.
Let the United Nations, beginning with its 75th anniversary, join hands with civil society in shaping the vision and actions we so urgently need to create the world we so eagerly await.
Make UN 75 count.
Make UN 75 count.
Make UN 75 count.
Make UN 75 count.
So some wonderful voices there from all around the world, including the younger generation talking about what they want in this world. So hello, everybody. I am Zainab Badawi, and it's my great pleasure to be presenting and moderating this panel discussion with some of the most eminent, prominent thinkers in the sphere of international relations, who are going to be bringing you their wisdom and their insights and their experiences about the topic we're talking about today. 75 years. Happy birthday to the United Nations as it looks back to its history and looks forward to what it should be doing in our world. What are the pluses and minuses? How can it work better? And what are the real challenges, the obstacles that have been thrown in its way in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which many fear has really set back progress on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, and may compromise that progress that was being made in the coming decade. So I've got 4 speakers. I'll just tell you very quickly who they are, but I'll introduce them once I come to speak to each of them. I'm going to have a chat pick their brains, as it were, for a little while, and then we've got some Q&As which are coming in from our all the people who are listening to this. So if I'm looking down every now and again, forgive me, but I'm just looking at what's coming into me on my iPad here. So Jan Eliasson, Lisa John, and also I see there is Vinton Surf, but Vinton, you prefer to be called Vint Surf, and also Abdullah Jani, and very, very good to see you all there. So Jan Eliasson, of course, many of you know, former Swedish foreign minister, has served in the United Nations in many capacities, most latterly until 2016 when he was deputy SG, and he's currently chair of the governing board of SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in his native Sweden. So Jan, really lovely to see you. Hello, I hope you're keeping well. Very good. Excellent.
I'm indeed great to be with you. In Sweden, it's 30 plus Celsius, so that's why I'm more informal than normally. But great to be with you at this wonderful celebration of the Charter.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a shame that this isn't in person, but we have to move with the times. So, Jan, give us, please, your kind of brief overview of the purpose of the United Nations when it was set up 75 years ago, and then just tell us where you think it is today before we move on to what it looks like in the future.
Well, 75 years ago, we had just had behind us a nightmare of history. I think that whole period between 1930 and 1945 was one of the darkest periods in human history. 50 million dead in the war, Holocaust, and extreme ideologies causing havoc. So what happened at the end of that horrible war was that people were simply longing for a new world and trying to set a new direction away from this dark period. And the Charter was the symbol of that. People were sitting in San Francisco and created this fantastic document. And it pointed forward to very simple things for us now, but at that time not at all simple, that we had to work together to achieve peace. We had to accept the fundamental human rights. We had to accept the rules of law and international law, and we had to accept social justice. And we set up in Chapter 1 the wonderful principles and purposes of the organization, built on this wonderful preamble. I happen to have on my desk the Charter, and this is probably my 13th version of it since 1980. But this is very important as a document.
Jan, I remember you telling me a while ago that you always keep the Charter of the United Nations somewhere on your person, in your jacket pocket or in your briefcase. Is that right?
Yes, always, since 1980. So this is a rather, I have another pretty more worn version around here. So, but the reason I put it up here is that we need to be reminded that we need to have principles and purposes established for us when we meet the daily crisis. Otherwise, we go zigzag back and forth. And if I move to today, I would say that we face maybe not the same dramatic situation as 1945, looking back at the war and all the other horrible things. But I would say the combination of COVID-19, the concerns, the real serious problems around climate change, the wars going on in Yemen and in Libya, and still not over in Syria, all these factors of unfinished business should lead us to a revival of the Charter and a renaissance of international cooperation, because international cooperation, unbelievable to me, is in danger. I never thought that I would have to defend international cooperation at this stage. So I think the challenge is here. I think we should see this as an occasion to move forward much more boldly towards what actually was meant by this Charter.
So when you say you never thought you'd have to defend international action, is that a reflection of the fact that the UN, when it was set up 75 years ago, the power of the nation state was much stronger than it is today? Problems were more national, whereas today, as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres always reminds us, we confront global problems that need global solutions. And the pandemic, of course, reminds us of that. And perhaps people don't appreciate that enough, that there isn't enough confidence in multilateralism. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think, first of all, we should be proud of some of the achievements of the UN in the past. Decolonization is, of course, maybe the most important one. 50 nations met in San Francisco, 1946. Now you are 193. And you have seen also that we were serious about we the peoples, the first three words of the Charter, because we established a system for development, for humanitarian assistance, for respect of human rights, setting up norms for people so that the organization was meaningful to every citizen. So what is at stake now is, I think, this belief in this, to me, absolute natural belief that we have to have international cooperation for issues like climate, migration, and all the issues, pandemic, the COVID-19, of course, and that this should be seen as self-evident, but it isn't. We have, unfortunately, some very strong movements that think that we can rather act unilaterally and we can get all these results from our own action. But I think we have to have this renaissance of international cooperation, and that we should use this day, and I hope that the declaration that is being worked out now in the General Assembly can be adopted unanimously, because it will be a sort of a new push for international cooperation. But I am surprised that we have to defend it in such a way that I thought was absolutely normal during this whole period of the build-up since 1945.
Interesting, thank you. Lisa John, you're Secretary General of Civicus, which of course is that global alliance of activists and civil society organisations which is supposed to strengthen the citizen action throughout the world. And you've worked a great deal in social justice, human rights, governance and accountability issues since 1998, more than 20 years ago, including as a strategy director for Save the Children and various high-level panels at the United Nations. So what's your take on this, from what Jan Eliasson said, that you have to try and renew people's faith in the ability of multilateralism, international cooperation to deliver? Do you share his sentiments that that is sorely lacking at the moment?
I think the fact that the UN Charter itself starts with the word "we the peoples" represents the fact that the biggest strength of the UN is the trust that individuals and groups have in that institution, and that's something that we need to really strongly hold on to and maintain. So the measure of success for the United Nations should always be how well governments serve the people that they represent in the UN itself. The assumption we're making here is that every person on the planet, no matter who they are or where they live, has the opportunity to be heard, has a voice, and that governments will represent their interests without discrimination in the UN. And that's what kind of creates that virtuous circle of where governments represent people's interests and then people believe in the power that the United Nations has to address their actual problems. I think the difficulty is that we know now that more than 3 or less than 3% of the world's population actually enjoys the freedom of speech or being heard, right? So less than 3% of the world's population actually enjoys the ability to exercise their civic freedoms fully, which is the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, and the freedom of assembly. And that means a huge percentage of the world's population actually doesn't feel very well represented or heard in international institutions. And I think that's what we need to address. We, the peoples, in the context of 2020, really must be a bold set of moves, a bold set of reforms to really make direct and meaningful participation of citizens and civil society enabled in the UN system.
All right, but Lisa, there are a lot of players now, aren't there, in the international space, many more than when the United Nations was set up. So how does the UN try to coordinate and get greater collaboration on that international level with other actors in that space?
So in present times, my identity as a citizen isn't only shaped by my relationship with the nation state, right? It's shaped by my place in my neighborhood, my relationship with my city, the way I behave as a consumer, or the fact that I'm part of a transnational online community. So I think what that really calls for is that as citizens, as people who live lives in various parts of the world, what we need is better systems to hold not just governments accountable, but also other stakeholders who are influencing the quality of our lives by the decisions that they make. So one of the exciting things about, for instance, the 2030 agenda, the UN agenda, is that it really envisages this dynamic collaboration and accountability amongst a wider range of stakeholders. And really important in that is the ability then for citizens to be able to exercise oversight, but also provide input in all aspects of global governance. So the private sector, for instance, which has grown exponentially since the time that the UN Charter was developed, for instance, has now impacted every aspect of our lives, but there hasn't been a simultaneous conversation on the rigor with which business responsibility needs to also accompany business power. And that's the kind of conversations we need to be seeing in the UN right now. In fact, at this very moment, there is a UN 75 People's Declaration that has some very specific examples of how the ability for citizens and civil society to engage in a much more meaningful way with the UN may be possible. This includes a World Citizens Initiative that would allow citizens to directly organize issues that they can bring to the UN. It includes the idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly so that elected representatives of people have a stronger say in the UN system. And then it includes the call, a very specific call for a high-level focal point in the UN system at the level of, Under Secretary General, which would allow the window for civil society and citizens to directly engage in decision-making possible.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Lisa. Thank you for that. So, Vint Cerf, you're one of the fathers of the internet. That's how you're described, and you co-designed the TCP/IP, which is the Transmission Control Protocol, and that's a set of networking protocols that allow two or more computers to communicate. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but that's just kind of my shorthand for it. It's a kind of architecture of the internet. And since 2005, you've been vice president and chief internet evangelist, as it were, for Google. Now, and you've served also as a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, chairman of the board of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Vint, I could go on and on and on, but I'd be here all day listing all the things that you've been on. But you have talked, Vint, about the similarities between the United Nations and the Internet. So how come?
So if you go back in time and you look at what motivated the creation of the United Nations, which we just heard a lovely summary of, you'll find a striking parallel, because 45 years ago, the internet design began as a multi-stakeholder discussion about how to get diverse networks to interconnect in a uniform way and to achieve a common objective, relying on a set of common principles. And so this idea of taking diversity and assembling it into something that was held in common and could be used for constructive purposes lies at the heart of the internet design. This creates a multi-stakeholder environment, and I want to emphasize how important it is now in the 21st century to keep in mind that while we think about multilateralism as a core essence of the United Nations, multi-stakeholder participation is turning out to be increasingly important. You've heard that theme repeatedly from the comments from earlier speakers. So at this stage of the game, we have this enormous platform, which at the moment reaches about half of the world. And I'm busy as the internet evangelist trying to get the other half of the world online. The important thing about all this is that it is collaboration and cooperation that allows this system to continue to evolve. And I would argue that those same ideas, those are essence of stewardship, is exactly what should motivate the United Nations and the nations and other participants that seek its success. So the internet is really a kind of a microcosm of all of the issues arising in the United Nations context.
Okay, but you've kind of outlined the lofty ideals, as it were, and the constructive role that the internet has, and compared that to the UN Charter. But there are huge numbers of minuses when it comes to the internet, doesn't it? And we've just seen these play out recently. We've seen how you have misinformation, on media platforms online. You've seen that some people use social media as a vehicle to advance hate speech, polarizing societies, undermining democracies, countries complaining about cyber warfare and all the rest of it. So how do you square that vision that you have of it being a force for good with all these negatives?
So first thing I would observe that we're doing this conversation on top of that World Wide Web and internet platform. So there. However, I would also point out that all of the ills that you've just described also are visited upon us in the what we'll call the real world as well as the cyber world. Why is that? The answer is us. It's people and the things that people are motivated to do. The internet is largely a technically neutral platform, and like all other neutral technologies, it can be used and it can be abused. And the use and the abuse is based not on the technology, but the decisions that people make as to how they will deploy and use it. And so if we want to deal with the serious problems of abuse on the internet, we are going to have to go after three possible responses. The first one is to find technical ways of mitigating the kinds of abuse that arise, denial of service attacks, distribution of malware, and other kinds of abuses. But that will not succeed 100%. We will not be able to stop people from using this technology in harmful ways. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is to say to people, if we catch you doing things like this, there will be consequences. And that's sort of post hoc enforcement. But even that is not necessarily going to solve the problem. Keep in mind, because the internet is global in scope and the packets of the internet have no clue that they just crossed an international boundary, that a perpetrator of harm could be in one country and the victim in another. What does that imply? It means we're going to have international agreements in order to identify and deal with people who do harmful things on the internet. Will we catch all of them? No. I will guess that most of the people who are participating in this call today have probably broken the law by speeding from time to time, and they didn't all get caught. So what do? What's the next step? Well, one answer to that is just tell people that it's wrong. Don't do those harmful things. It's morally wrong. And that sounds weak, but I need to remind you that gravity is the weakest force in the universe, but when you get enough mass, it holds the planets in place. If you have a large enough body of people who adopt norms of behavior, that social pressure can be very powerful. So those are my three nostrums for dealing with the problems you raise.
And you talked about an international agreement for this kind of governance of what goes on the internet. And a lot of people talking at the moment about, what role the internet giants should take themselves, the Googles, the Facebooks, and all the rest of it. Is there space for the United Nations then in setting up these international agreements? Because some people are asking national governments to do things.
Well, if the international arena is not prepared to undertake some of these agreements, then plainly nation states may feel the need to act in order to protect their citizens. My belief is that the United Nations has the capacity to respond. That's what the high-level panel on digital cooperation was all about. It was to find things that we could do not simply as nations, but as multi-stakeholders, the technical community, civil society, the private sector, as well as governments, working together to find norms and practices that will mitigate the harms and accentuate the value of this global system.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Vint. And Abdoulaye Janneh, my friend there, you've been waiting patiently. And Abdoulaye Janneh, of course, is a very distinguished Gambian statesman and economist, and currently executive director of the Liaison with Governments and Institutions in Africa for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. But you've had a very distinguished career as an international civil servant. You're executive secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in the past, and also regional director for UNDP, regional director for Africa. And you're also chair of the African Governance Institute, amongst various things. So, you know, Abdoulaye, that one of the constant criticisms we get of the United Nations, and it seems right to discuss it again at this 75th landmark anniversary, which is it does not reflect the world as it is today. It reflects the world as it was in 1945. Mm-hmm. But nothing's ever done.
Well, let me preface my brief thing by first saluting the Charter. I think it's a credible, fundamental document that is helping us to shape the type of world we want to live in. And I want to salute the role of the United Nations. I know that people say all we did was decolonization and fight against apartheid. I think we did far more than that. Those are great achievements. But if you see what we've done in peacekeeping, and talking as an African, peacekeeping operations pacified Africa. And we still have problems there, but pacified Africa. What we did, what the UN did in promoting understanding on the climate change, fighting genocide and all that. So the UN has done great things, I think, great things. But there are still some challenges, and these challenges relate to, the setup, the institutional setup in the UN, which has not changed since 1945. And primary one there is the Security Council. Security Council, which at that time, the way it was set up was very relevant. It brought in victors from a world war, and we thought they were the best suited to really make sure that we don't go back to war again. But times have changed, as you said. Times have changed considerably. And it's about time whilst not removing those who are there, but to enlarge it. We in Africa feel that we are almost 1.2 billion people now, the biggest landmass, and really not to give us a stronger voice in the Security Council. We think it's unfair, it's not inclusive, it's unjust. And the debate is going on, but it's incessant. It's gone, and we are losing patience on this. And I hope that to celebrate the 75th anniversary, we will all agree to giving a place to Africa. There are others too who really deserve, but I'm not here to plead their cause. I'm saying with 1.2 billion people, we need a seat in the Security Council. And because the Security Council is like that, it's affecting other big multilaterals. They feel they can do what is happening in the Security Council. So I hope that 75 years after, we are turning the page, making it more inclusive, selecting the best people that we can put in, and making countries, making the institutions more reflect the realities of the world now.
So when you say that the United Nations has achieved a lot for the continent of Africa, you cited peacekeeping, for instance. I mean, and we had Jan Ellison mention decolonization and so on. I mean, when you look at the UN and what it's done in the last decades, has it been very good for Africa, do you think? I mean, besides the fact that Africa's not got a permanent seat on the Security Council, has it provided effective global leadership on behalf of Africa?
Oh, yes, without doubt, without doubt. I have worked for over 2 decades in the United Nations. I am an African, and I stayed on because I felt not only that it was fulfilling its global responsibilities, but it was contributing tremendously to what was happening in Africa. I mentioned peace building, but the whole development work, the UN agencies, FAO, UNDP, they're strong there in the forefront of the development efforts in Africa. And we should salute the United Nations for this. We build capacity. We have helped them institute norms I would say, help them to build capable states. that really respect the norms of norms of what a state should be like, and undertake the necessary development efforts. So I think at the forefront of that is the UN, because these countries, when they became independent, were weak. They were not that strong. These days, of course, they are relatively strong, but they still need UN as partners. The only thing is now they tell the UN what they want the UN to do for them. And the UN has also adapted from that point of view. They are really collaborating with Africans on the priorities identified by the individual African states, individual, at the sub-regional, and at the continental level. And I hope that this will continue. What we will plead for, of course, more resources for the UN, because the agenda is bigger, the challenges are bigger, the cost certainly naturally would also be bigger. Therefore, we need more support for the UN to promote this agenda in Africa.
All right, Abdullah, I'm going to stay with you because I've got some questions here which are coming from our audience, and I'll relay them to you. So one for you here. 75 years ago, the signing of the UN Charter took place, realizing the new challenges faced by countries, especially in Africa. How can the UN ensure that Africa is part of the conversation when focusing on the United Nations Security Council? When will Africa become part of the Council? I know you've said we want to be, but when is this question here? And it goes on to the question that says, we need and require a UN that is adjusted to the new normal and realities. African youth believe that Africa can play its role in securing the continent and the planet. Okay, so a long question there, but it's the when. You expressed the aspiration.
Yes. You know, you are dealing with a humongous organization with humongous membership. First, there's a forum where every state has equal voice. So we have to find an equilibrium between where we have this voice for every country and this other animal that sits on top of that, which is the Security Council. When we will be able to reform it, it will take some time. But it is high on the agenda. There is no meeting that takes place that we do not talk about the Security Council. There is a permanent committee of the African Union, which is saying we need a seat, we need a permanent seat, we even need a veto. Maybe that's pushing it too far, but we cannot put a timeline on it. I hope, if you ask me when, by the end of this year, but it will not happen. Jan is there, Jan is smiling. It will take some time, but eventually I think we will get there.
All right, well, I'll ask you that, Jan. Go on, Jan, just give us a when. We've been discussing this ad nauseam, but do you have a time frame?
No, I think Abdul is right, because it takes some time to change the charter, but you can do something already now. You can look at the veto as more or less a failure. If the P5, the permanent 5, were to come to the conclusion that it is a negotiation failure, not to deliver a unified resolution, then you would diminish the gap between the permanent members and non-permanent members. I think you can gain a lot by really making the Security Council a negotiation body. It is very sad now that the very good proposal by Secretary General Guterres on a global ceasefire during the pandemics was not accepted by the Security Council. It's up their alley. It is about international peace and security. And a blessing from the Security Council would have been enormously important to bring about more unity on the fight against COVID-19. I was at the UN when we had UN Security Council action on Ebola. It's done in the past on AIDS. I think it was also on avian flu. Why haven't we reached that state now? This reflects the fact that we today, unfortunately, see growing tensions between very major powers, particularly US and China. And when there is no trust between the permanent 5, then you have run always this risk, like we saw in Syria, where you cannot come out with strong resolutions.
Okay, Vince, you wanted to come in here?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. I was thinking about a different perspective for a moment for Africa. We don't want Africa to feel as if its value is limited only by its participation in the United Nations. You're 1 billion people, 50 some odd countries. And it seems to me that investment in infrastructure and igniting the private sector on the African continent, access to internet, available online resources, education, I could go on and on. The point here is that you have a presence which exceeds your visibility in the United Nations, and I think that Africa needs to take advantage of its potential outside of the UN itself only. And I'm not trying to argue that you shouldn't be pressing hard for representation and visibility in the UN, but you also have the option of expanding your visibility in other sectors, and I'd like to encourage that.
Okay, Lisa, John, have you got something to bring in here? It doesn't pertain just to Africa, doesn't it? I mean, you get India saying, we want to be a member of the P5 and so on. So what's your view on this issue of the P5?
So I think the biggest change that we need to make, and which we're seeing people, especially who are part of new social movements, making, is not to limit the sense of their identity to their country or their region. I mean, we really need this moment to be a moment where we move into the idea of global citizenship and embrace it and really know what it means and live it in all aspects of our lives. And therefore, all the people I interact with, for instance, are really not buying into that game of, the traditional power play of the UN Security Council, or which, countries have what negotiating rights in the UN. The UN must represent the transnational issues and priorities that people on the ground have been fighting for and continue to fight for. These are real life issues related to discrimination, related to violence, related to equality, and the bigger picture, kind of the big ticket issues which generally draw the attention of the media and the governments, is not what people right now want and are really desperate for change around. And I think shifting the conversation back to those transformations that really need to happen, which will enable people to live a much better standard of life wherever they are, is what we need more to see from. And there are places in the UN where that's happening. The UN Human Rights Council, for instance, is a place where citizens have a direct voice, civil society can participate. We need the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council to step up and provide that kind of leadership to what people on the ground really want.
All right, Abdullah Jania, I mean, so both Vint and Lisa, they're saying, don't be too fixated on the mechanisms, whether you've got a seat on the Permanent Security Council. Focus on the issues and the outcomes of what you want to see, how you want to see the world.
No, I don't think Vince has departed from the need to democratize further some of the institutions in the UN. Where you say, in addition to the UN, have other partners. And what he read out, if he talks to any African leader now, that's their blueprint to move their countries. Widen the partnership, engage the private sector more. We should do that.
Okay.
But then the whole issue of global citizenships and so on, this is fine, we accept. But in the UN, Jan Ellison just gave us an example. We are in the middle of COVID, and the Secretary General appealed for ceasefire. This was vetoed by the Security Council. Who vetoed it and so on? We don't want to go into that. So the Security Council sits permanently on all the major decisions that you take. So therefore, it cannot continue as business as usual.
All right, Jan Eliasson, and in fact, a question has come on email. We've touched on it really already, but nevertheless, I'll just ask you to touch on it. The question is this: the UN Charter is a visionary document. Among others, in Article 2, as you will know, Jan, it states that the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. So how does that relate to the veto power of the P5? We've touched on that, so maybe I add a supplementary to that, which is, was the writing of the UN Charter flawed in the first place, this document that you hold so dear?
Well, you cannot deny that there are two different categories in the Security Council. Those who are there non-permanently for 2 years, and those who sit there forever. and that cannot be denied. I think, having been in contact with someone who was actually present in San Francisco, that there was a bit of unease among those who wrote the charter to accept the veto role. But I think they came to the conclusion, and so did the governments in the negotiations, that there was a need to have the great powers on board for solutions. There were mistakes during the League of Nations, and you saw what happened in the 30s in the different conflicts, and League of Nations was weak in this regard and didn't have the full support of all major powers. So maybe that was a sacrifice they had to make, but that means that the Permanent Five have a tremendous responsibility to also represent the majority of the nations. The preamble of the Charter says that we are to live together peacefully. That is the whole promise, to leave that scourge of war behind us. And that means that you have to move away from your own interest partly and see that you have a global responsibility. And that means that you should negotiate resolutions. One of my biggest frustrations during my 5 years as Deputy Secretary General was that we never got a strong enough resolution for the war in Syria, because the Russia and US were on different sides, and then there was proxy war in the area with Iran and Saudi and Qatar and Turkey fighting out their own differences inside Syria. But anyway, the point is that we have to understand that in today's world, and that's what this promise must be at the 75th anniversary, that security lies in working together. The word together is the most important word in the world right now. We are going a different direction in some of the political discourse.
So thank you for that, Jan. Related to that, Lisa, a question that I'll put to you that's come in, which is the UN Charter was signed 75 years ago. What are some of your thoughts on its relevance? You kind of told us a little bit about that already, but anyway, should the international community consider updating this document to reflect current realities? So are you going to say on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN, we need to go back to the drawing board and write it all up again?
No, I think the values that it kind of conveys and holds continues to be relevant today and will continue to be relevant beyond this time. The means and the processes to get there is what needs to change. And I think we were at a moment then when governments were the major actors. You know, the trust in governments was extremely high. The fact that they were the ones who were building this charter and committing themselves to implement it was something that was, the way that the world worked then. Today, citizens have a much stronger sense of agency. All of the movements you've seen in 2019 on climate or forms of governance accountability, really call to the need for that direct, voice and mechanisms in the UN. So the UN isn't someone outside us. It should be us and a representation of what we want. And if we continue to talk about it as if it's a third party or something that we need to kind of negotiate and lobby and influence, it's not really going to work for the rest of us. It really has to be that space where you see young people today wanting to be part of decisions, wanting to co-design solutions, wanting to be part of the negotiations that actually result in the changes that they need, not just in their immediate future, but in the long-term future, especially when you talk about the environment and the planet. So I think the current form of governance and the current form of relationship between governments and people really needs a reset. It's just not working for people anymore. That's why you're seeing unrest and the rise of movements across the world. And I think that's the crying call that people on the streets are making. We are not being heard. We're not being represented. We don't want this form of representation anymore where somebody else speaks for us. We want to be heard directly. And I think that's the unlearning that governments who form the UN need to do and then expand the space for that engagement.
Vince, sir, if you want to come in here.
I'm thinking about context, and I'm thinking the UN was born out of a devastating period of conflict. 75 years later, our situation is surely better than it was then. On the other hand, we are in the midst of a serious pandemic. We are also facing global warming. The context that we're in now needs safety and security and peace as enablers for something else, survival. And what that suggests to me is that we now need to take into our hands, the UN needs to adopt a sense of stewardship for resources that are both natural and artificial. As examples of this, the internet is an artificial resource that we need to continue to support and expand. Look at what we're doing with it right now. So my sense is that we might look at a new context in which the UN work should be fashioned. And I see that we have another comment coming from our former ambassador.
But yeah, I'll come back to you in a moment, Jan Eliasson, but I'll just stay with you, Vince, because you've not had a question from our question webinar, as it were, which is, you mentioned COVID-19, and the question is this: especially in the times of COVID-19, access to technology is key. How do we overcome the digital divide between countries, but also between regions? You mentioned that earlier on, and then I'll come back to you, Jan. Vint.
So the good news is that physics is in our court. It's in our corner. The cost of getting access to these technologies is coming down, making it more and more affordable over time. And I can assure you the private sector is very motivated to try to drive cost out of communications and devices that are programmable. So that part is the good news. But what is needed in addition to that are terms and conditions and legislative frameworks that will encourage private sector investment, for example, or public-private partnerships in order to create infrastructure upon which we can build these technologies. I am persuaded, looking at the last roughly 40 plus years of Internet's evolution, that we still are making progress, but we clearly have to analyze why we don't have capability where it's needed. We need to measure where it isn't and make sure that we invest in creating Internet access where it can be achieved. We see some interesting investments coming. For example, this global satellite system that Elon Musk and SpaceX is putting together is an example of a massive investment by the private sector. Undersea cables have been expanding rapidly. So in my view, the good news is that there's serious investment. The nations of the world and the UN need to help with recommendations that create frameworks in which that investment is encouraged.
Right. Oh, you have such an optimistic, sunny outlook, Vince, don't you? Thank you very much. Jan Eliasson, you wanted to come in. I'll do that. But also, if you could answer this question that's coming for you, isn't the largest challenge of the UN accountability regarding the gap between theory and practice, promises and deeds, the talk and the walk? There's a big gap there. So that's a question for you there. But also preface it with what you wanted to say in response to Vint.
Thank you, Zainab. I want to build on what Lisa and Vint just said. I think we realize we must mobilize all actors who could make a difference now in the direction ahead. I hope we end up with more of international cooperation rather than less after post-COVID-19. So in this case, it means that we cannot look only at governments or at international organizations. We must look at the private sector, we must look at the civil society, we must look at the academic and scientific world. You and me, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. We need a mobilization. And here I want to say that one of the most important tools we have, which will be discussed, I think, at the next panel, is the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals is the action plan also for the Paris Climate Agreement. These 17 goals are mutually reinforcing, and they are actually the ones that can help us not fall into hopelessness on the world ahead. We need to have tools, and we need to have hope. And I think the SDGs are. The other reasons for hope is, to me, women, the women's empowerment, which is coming, an enormously positive historic force, the voices of youth. We should not only work for young people, we must work with young people. And then the enormous importance from the contributions from science and technology to development. And lastly, of course, the international cooperation, which is absolutely crucial. So the walking and talking, I think when I worked at the UN, I always felt good when I come back from the field, whether it was on peacekeeping missions or humanitarian missions or development missions, because that's where I saw the work on the ground with vaccinations, some things that Ambassador Yama just mentioned, you know, the realities on the ground. And that we should see much more often than sometimes the political discussion, which leads to division and polarization.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. So now just very quickly in reverse order, just your closing remarks, please. And you've actually touched on it already, Jan. Final point, 75 years since the signing of the UN Charter, given the fact that today we have the youngest global youth population in history. How are the voices of young people included in the member states' resolutions and deliberations and to the work of the United Nations? So Abdullah Jenny, representing the youngest continent on earth, your closing remarks incorporating that, please.
We should be thankful that the United Nations exists. The whole issue of saying, do you walk the talk? I spent several years on the ground in the field working for the UN. And really, the achievements are commendable. I wouldn't say astonishing, but commendable. And the average person in Africa associates the UN with our development work, with our peacekeeping work and so on. Those operations, we touch their lives, which makes their countries more livable. And the level of appreciation of that is colossal. That's one point I want to make. Second is, I was listening to Lisa. How do we expand the debate base in the UN? We have 192 countries. That's already unwieldy. So I was saying that maybe the countries should incorporate other sections of their society in their delegations. If you feel something, private sector should be there, put the private sector in there. Bring young people into your delegation and so on. But expanding the forum now is impossible unless you create special forum where they will have discussion of a special issue. So that is something that I think we should look at. But making the UN more democratic, more reflective of the concerns of people is fine. But let me just close and say, Zainab, I worked for a couple of decades in the UN. If I had to do it all over again, will I do so? Absolutely.
Oh, well, great vote of confidence there. Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah Jenny. So brief closing remarks from you, Vint Cerf. Thank you.
So here's a tough question for all of us. Is the UN fit for purpose? And we must ask that question of ourselves. It's a 75-year-old institution. It has its history. It has a future, and it faces a future which has some serious challenges. And we need to ask ourselves, should we not evolve in response to those pressures and those challenges in order to meet them? And so I think you've been hearing from many of us and the questions that you've asked, that the impression I have is that people are ready to ask that question and to respond by saying that we need to adapt this institution in order to meet the challenges ahead. And I would challenge all of us who are responsible for the UN's current operation to take that seriously.
Thank you. Lisa John from Civicus, your closing remarks. Youth, include them, and is the 75th Charter fit for purpose? You've answered that, but your closing remarks.
So, just a reminder that the best things that have come out of the UN, whether it was the Geneva Resolution, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, even the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, which 1 million people contributed to the consultations that led to that, have come out when the UN has opened its doors, and by the UN I mean governments have opened their doors and allowed citizens and publics to engage with the agenda they want to shape. And I think we should never forget that the UN ultimately belongs to people. It's only going to be as good as the governments that are in there, and the governments then being held accountable to provide that information to us and involve us in the decisions that they make. So I think going forward, we really need to challenge governments to do better, not just to talk to formal civil society, but to new social movements, to people on the ground, and really get better at how they represent public interest. And I think that's what will make the UN, the kind of vibrant, inclusive space that we continue to need it to be.
Thank you very much indeed. And the final word to you, Jan Eliasson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can look back at many achievements, as we've talked about several failures that we also have talked about. But I always think of the UN as a reflection, a mirror of the world in two perspectives. It's a mirror and a reflection of the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. That has to be the starting point. We can't have rosy glasses on and look at these realities. We got to meet them head on. But we must never forget that the UN is also a mirror reflection of the world as it should be. We need in life always to have a UN charter in our brains and hearts so that we know what direction to go. And I think that was the idea of the people who sat down and wrote this beautiful document exactly 75 years today. And I think we need to now try to build up a new sense of revival for international cooperation and for the principles and purposes that were the result of this horrible Second World War and what preceded it. So I think we have a great thing, a great agenda in front of us. One thing very concrete I'd like to finish with saying is that we should look at security, not only in military terms. We spend almost $2 trillion on military expenditure in the world. We must look at security in the sense of the quality of a society, the economic and social situation. We must see it in terms of climate change and pandemics. And if we broaden that view of security to include the developmental aspects, then we can also build the bridges that is so necessary in a world which is still haunted by inequalities. But I think it's a wonderful organization with all its problems. It has also a great promise. So let's hope that we will have a great celebration at the 100th anniversary.
Let's hope. Thank you so much indeed, Jan Eliasson, former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Lisa John from Civicus, Vince, father of the Internet, one of the fathers of the Internet, and of course, Abdullah Jenner from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. That concludes this panel discussion about the UN. Looking the past, present, and the future. I hope you found the discussion as interesting and as stimulating as I have. Before I hand over to the next session, I should say that we're going to bring you a short video of the 75th anniversary campaign, because of course there's no big 75th birthday party, but the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, wanted to listen to the people who the UN serves. So in January, the UN launched the biggest global conversation, and this coming video will tell you about that. Let me also remind you, if you want to listen to any of the proceedings in one of the UN's official languages, then you just tap on the icon with the music notes on your computer. But for me, Zainab Badawi, it's been a great pleasure to be with all of you, and looking forward to the 100th anniversary of the United Nations, and I hope we can all have a big party then, since we've missed it this time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, panel. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is marking its 75th anniversary at a time of great challenge, as COVID-19 continues to upend lives of people across the world. It has brought underlying inequalities into stark relief. It has accelerated existing trends, including in the digital sphere. And it has ousted challenges such as conflict and climate change from the headlines, although they continue unabated. At the same time, the pandemic has underscored how interconnected we are and how crucial it is for us to work together. As much as it reflects the hopes, aspirations, the ideals of we the peoples, the UN Charter embodies the recognition by hard-nosed world leaders that the costs of cooperation and compromise are infinitely less than the costs of war. Cooperation and compromise remain essential today, The past weeks have shown that huge transformations are possible when political will aligns itself with public support. The Secretary-General has called on us to recover better from this crisis and to build sustainable, inclusive, and resilient societies and economies. This will require leadership by governments as well as action by all stakeholders. Now is the time to put into practice the commitment to future generations that is central to the UN Charter, and to make progress on the future we want and the UN we need to achieve that vision. That is the spirit in which the UN's 75th anniversary was conceived last year, not as a celebration, but as a moment of reflection, of humility, and of listening on the part of the United Nations. The world is in upheaval, and global cooperation needs urgent resuscitation. That is why in January, we launched a global consultation to better understand people's hopes and fears for the future, as well as their priorities and ideas for action. The short video that will play next provides a flavor of the initiative to date. The full results of our global listening tour will be presented on 21 September 2020 at the official commemoration of the anniversary with heads of state here in New York. I will highlight only one finding today. Across all regions, all age groups, and social groups, we see overwhelming support for global cooperation, with a clear increase since COVID-19 began to spread. It remains to be seen whether the pandemic will unite us with renewed purpose and vigor. I hope that history will show that 2020 was the year when humanity changed course and began its march towards a better future for all. Thank you.
أتمنى إنه يكون يوم للسلام ويوم للعدالة.
And lead from a place of empathy for humanity as well as nature.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
Turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
Do you dare to? Those challenging and inspiring words from one of the amazing young people we just heard should ring clearly in all of our ears at this decisive juncture in our world. Do you dare? Do we dare? Can we dare together to shape a better world within our grasp at this turning point in our collective history? That's what we want to use the next hour of this historic occasion to discuss. Do we dare, and what will it take? Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Cousins, President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation, and I'm honored to join you all today on UN Charter Day. 75 years ago, world leaders and their citizens, battered by a war that had taken the souls of millions, shattered economies, and broken lives, came together to create the United Nations. They were not best friends. They didn't share every value, but they understood that their peoples all had more to gain from cooperation than conflict. And they created an institution to give practical effect to that conviction. 5 years ago, world leaders and their citizens, buoyed by gains they saw all around them, the hundreds of millions lifted out of extreme poverty in a generation, the millions of lives saved by vital health interventions for mothers and children, the track record of ending wars and building peace, not everywhere, but not nowhere, adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and an agenda for progress that put people first and made a promise to leave no one behind. And today, we are again battered and by a new threat, a virus that exploits our every weakness, whether that is poverty, inequity, racism, or xenophobia. The question for all of us today, just as it was in 1945, is whether we have the courage, the foresight, the imagination to see how much more unites than divides us. Do we dare to? This session is about the future, and it's about the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. We will hear video messages from leaders across sectors about the future they expect and are committed to build. We will have the incredible privilege of a conversation with the inimitable Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, a fearless leader and a dear friend, Her Excellency Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. And we will conclude our time with music, with art, with individual musicians on their individual instruments across geographies, playing in harmony. We should be together in person, but in this moment, even as we are together virtually, our solidarity is real. Let's turn first to a video with perspectives from 5 remarkable individuals about the future not only that they want, but that they are building every day.
I'm Folie Batibo. As a journalist, an advocate, and champion for the rights of women and an African woman, the UN gives me hope. I celebrate the UN because of the first 3 words of its charter, we the peoples. For millions around the world, the UN is a unique organization that represents togetherness, whether they know it exists or not. In its commitment to its 193 members to encourage and promote collaboration, to provide peace, dignity, and equality to a healthy planet, the UN is me, it's you, it's all of us. Now, over the last 20 years, my work in television broadcasting, both as a journalist, as an anchor, has given me the opportunity to engage with the UN. I've had the privilege and honor to see the workings of the UN firsthand through various engagements and interactions. A significant moment came in July 2016 when I had the honor of co-moderating the first ever live televised debate of candidates running for the post of United Nations Secretary General. But I have to say that it's been my work as an advocate for the rights of women and girls that has long inspired my collaborations with the United Nations. As an African woman, I'm acutely aware of the challenges that women and girls on my continent face. They range from lack of access to education, child marriage, female genital mutilation, gender-based violence, just to name a few. The list is long. But it's reassuring to be able to see the work being done on the ground by the UN, from supporting communities through education and programs to supporting governments at their points of need to advocacy, always with the mindset of working hand in hand with people. From my early and ongoing collaborations with UNFPA in West and Central Africa as they work on delivering a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled, to my more recent work with the UN-EU Spotlight Initiative Partnership to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, it's always a privilege to support the UN whenever called upon and wherever possible. So it was an honor to be invited to be part of Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the president of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly Group of Gender Equality Leaders, a group established to benefit from the expertise of eminent leaders in the public and private spheres who share the common goal of accelerating the promotion of gender equality around the world. It's initiatives and partnerships like this, coming from the highest levels of the UN, that ensure the continuous connection of the organization with the people it was set up to help. Another area close to my heart as a journalist is UNESCO's promotion of the safety of journalists through the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. As we're seeing on a daily basis, unfortunately, the need for such a plan is even more critical in these times where the media is regularly being attacked and projected as the enemy, and the safety and well-being of journalists appears to be no longer guaranteed. As you're well aware, we're now living through some of the most difficult times in our recent history. Health pandemics such as COVID-19, climate change, racism, systemic inequalities know no boundaries. So the UN turning 75 during this period could not be more significant and very much speaks to its role in the future we all want. The crucial role being played by the UN and all its agencies has not only been one of a global convener, but also of global solidarity. Nothing in life is guaranteed, and our world is rapidly changing. But as long as we stand together alongside this unique organization called the United Nations, I have no doubt in my mind that we, the people, have much to be hopeful for in the next 75 years. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to mark this very special anniversary with you. Happy 75th birthday, United Nations.
Hi, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be joining you from Johannesburg, South Africa, where, as you can tell by the size of my afro, I have been under lockdown in my apartment for the last several weeks. As we come together to observe, commemorate, and reflect upon the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, I am reminded of the hauntingly exquisite poem, A Brave and Startling Truth. This poem was written by the late Dr. Maya Angelou and recited by her in 1995 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. In this poem for humanity, I am struck by the last few lines when Dr. Angelou says, "When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible. We are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it." This is the brave and startling truth. And of course, the other brave and startling truth is that we are bearing witness to a confluence of world historical events. COVID-19, the deep economic downturn, and of course, racial justice. And all of these events illuminate for the world the ways in which human suffering is unevenly distributed and geographically and socially mapped onto the current terrain of inequality and injustice. But as heartbreaking as we feel, as anxiety-inducing as this moment is, it is also one that is pregnant with possibility. The possibility of doing better and the possibility of being better. That is the invitation, and that is the rallying cry that we must heed. As one of the youngest advocates of the Secretary General's advocacy group for the Sustainable Development Goals, I say bravo to all of the young people throughout the world who are marching and ushering us into a new dawn of inclusion and equality for everyone. I give a shout out to those of us who are furthest behind the line of opportunity. People with disabilities, young people, indigenous people, those of us who bear the brunt of the cruelest forms of neglect, trauma, and isolation. I am confident that the Global Goals for Sustainable Development is the blueprint and will allow us to build back better from the rubble of the pandemic and from the rubble of everything that we're bearing witness to now in real time. But in order to do so, we must be inclusive. We must amplify the voices and center the needs and center the experiences of those who are furthest behind the line of opportunity.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to be able to address you all on the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter. My name is Sandra Wu, and I'm the chairperson and CEO of a Japanese company and a member of the UN Global Compact Board. In the 75 years since World War II, the UN has tirelessly worked to make our world a safe and peaceful place, insisting that the basic human rights and the freedoms are accorded to everyone across the globe. In this world, businesses have greatly flourished. We were able to focus on providing goods and the services required by society as well as employment. In the world you helped create over the last 75 years, the private sector has collectively great global reach. Businesses across the world are contributing to economic prosperity, and even during this pandemic, keeping up the flow of goods and services that supports our global society. However, the negative impacts of globalization and the market economy have also grown over the past 75 years. And that is why in 1999, then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called out to business leaders from all over the world to form a compact that would give a human face to the global market. Since that day, the UN Global Compact has grown to more than 10,000 companies. We businesses are taking action under the guidance of UN's principles, framework, and the global goals, with the intention to bring our business strengths to bear on creating a better world and the future we want. How, you might ask? My company, Kokusai Kogyo, and our larger group entity, Japan Asia Group, mainstream and integrated sustainability into the core of our organization. We count disaster risk reduction and the climate action as core business areas. The way we operate, including our handling of the COVID crisis, reflects our core value and puts health and the livelihood of our workers first. We work to reach science-based emission reduction targets as part of the business ambition for 1.5 degrees initiative. In a fair world, business would be rewarded for providing goods and the services that contribute to the well-being of people and the planet, but not for what damages them. We need the UN to create this fair world. The private sector and the rest of society rely on the UN to bring all the countries together, to create a space where we can all contribute towards a sustainable future. We are here with you, to work with you, together with all stakeholders to deliver on the commitment set out in the UN 75 Declaration. Congratulations again on your 75th anniversary. This is a great day. Thank you.
A warm thank you to President Mohammed Bande for inviting the World Benchmarking Alliance to this 75th anniversary ceremony. Your Excellencies, friends, we're thrilled to be part of the UN's largest conversation on the sustainable world we want. WBA is a multi-stakeholder alliance launched at the fringe of UNGA 2018. Our work and vision have always centered around the SDGs. We bring together diverse actors to incentivize the private sector to meet the goals, and we hold it to account in how it does so. We do this by measuring the performance of the 2,000 most influential companies around the world. These are the companies that can lead and enable systems change in every region. Our methodologies and indicators consider impact in 7 systems. We measure company policies and practices as well as supply chains. We need to tackle these systemic, social, economic and environmental issues. Urgent action now seems more pressing than ever. For us, this means helping companies translate the SDGs into concrete actions through our benchmarks. It also means keeping everything we do as a free public good so that everyone can join the transparency movement in holding the companies to account. This will help them to also build back better. And this is the systemic change we need to see for a planet that is fit for future generations everywhere.
The SDGs place people first, and so should companies. The private sector has a responsibility to support human development in a way that respects the rights of workers, consumers, and the wider community. To reflect this, WBA will assess 2,000 companies against a common set of core social expectations that all companies must meet. Through this process, we will also put a spotlight on specific issues that deserve deeper analysis, like our gender equality and women's empowerment benchmark and our human rights benchmark that focuses on high-risk sectors.
One of the most pressing global challenges of our time is feeding a growing population of 10 billion people by 2050 with sustainably produced food. Research shows that it is possible to transform our food system, but that it requires multi-sector action. Companies have enormous capacity to drive this change. WBA's Food and Agriculture Benchmark will assess 350 leading companies from across the entirety of the food system. Leading up to and at the UN Food System Summit in 2021, we look forward to continuing this conversation further with you.
Digital technologies have a transformative impact on many industries. The current pandemic has accelerated the importance of this digital revolution and increased the need for ICT companies to act responsibly. For digital technologies to benefit everyone everywhere, barriers in access, skills, use, innovation must be mitigated. WBA's Digital Inclusion Benchmark, launched this autumn, will track the contribution of the 100 most significant ICT companies in the world.
A major decarbonization and energy transformation is needed to align with global efforts to prevent the worst impacts of climate change and limit global warming. Private sector engagement alongside action by governments and civil society are critical for meeting the Paris Agreement. WBA's Climate and Energy Benchmark will rank 450 companies from around the world in high-emitting sectors. This process of benchmarking is set to be the accountability mechanism that will measure corporate progress against the Paris Agreement to get the planet to where it needs to be.
Looking to the future beyond UN 75, I will conclude with 5 calls to action, which are key for this decade of action. First, to businesses. Following COVID-19, there is a need for a transparency revolution in the private sector. So we ask you to embrace benchmarks and learn from them as you align your practices for our planet's future. We need to transform capital markets and financial institutions to meet long-term challenges of the SDGs. Second, to governments. We look forward to your assistance in advancing a decade of disclosure amongst businesses to fill gaps of inaction and in encouraging the role that civil society can play. As recent global protests indicate, your efforts must include ending discrimination in all forms, whether based on race, gender, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or other status. Third, to civil society. Remind governments and businesses alike about the need to listen and learn from all stakeholders, including those from the most vulnerable communities. This best happens when stakeholders from all levels are involved to create systems transformations. Fourth, to WBA ourselves. We are committed to transform business while working with our allies, civil society, governments, and the UN. We aspire to be the accountability mechanism for the SDGs. Fifth, to our friends at the UN. Thank you for your leadership and for keeping the lights on, even amidst these challenging times. Please keep us on course to achieve the SDGs and continue to advance multilateralism, inclusivity, and partnerships necessary to realize the future we all want.
Was that good?
Hi, my name is Karthik Sahani, and I'm a disability advocate, SDG Young Leader, and the co-founder of iSTEM, an organization where we use technology, community, and support services to empower people with disabilities. There are over 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world, and for the longest time, we have had to rely on others for even the most basic of things, such as reading, writing, and travel, etc. But this past century has seen remarkable progress thanks to technology. Whether it is screen readers that help me as a blind person to use a computer independently, or real-time captioning that helps someone who is deaf or hard of hearing access information on an equal basis, we have come a long way. Yet, there continues to be significant accessibility challenges. Majority of people with disabilities are still unable to access information on an equal basis because of it being inaccessible. And COVID-19 has made this even more apparent. with people not being able to access crucial health information disseminated by member states, and students not being able to complete their classes due to inaccessible content and platforms, there clearly is a big gap. What is even more concerning is the attitudinal barriers that continue to plague our society, which has resulted in a lot of people not even being able to access the most basic of facilities, such as healthcare. Despite these challenges, I am hopeful. It is great that the Sustainable Development Goals that I see as a manifestation of the UN Charter today explicitly calls out the need to work towards providing equal opportunities and access for people with disabilities. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been extremely helpful for advocates like me to be able to demand my rights. But I hope for a lot more. I want the UN to work even more closely with people with disabilities and young people to not only understand our aspirations, but also include us in the process to realize these aspirations. I want the UN to hold member states accountable for our fundamental right of equal access to information. I want the UN to lead by example by requiring everything created and used within the organization to be universally accessible. I'm looking to all of you for your support and the opportunity for me and other young people like me to work with you to realize and co-create the world that we all want to see. Thank you.
Thank you to all of these visionary leaders for sharing what you are doing, what you expect others to do, and what you believe is possible when we work shoulder to shoulder. You all issued a challenge of being better and doing better. You all invoked the SDGs as a blueprint for a future worthy of our children. You all spoke about putting people first on a planet that must also be cherished, and you also all called the world to action. And when it comes to the SDGs, or to climate change, or to racial injustice or other forms of inequity, we should count ourselves lucky, because we're the generations right now that have a shot to do things differently. The SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the people you've just heard, Black Lives Matter, Fridays for the Future, remembering that the United Nations was created for a reason, and it was a good reason. That's our shot, and those don't come around every day. And that's among the many reasons that I am delighted to introduce next Her Excellency, Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. We could have no better person to reflect on what this moment means and what we are called on to do together to realize the founding aspirations of the Charter of the United Nations in a new era. Amina Mohammed has served the public from the earliest stirrings of her career. She has helped design schools and clinics in Nigeria, her home country. She has advised her government on strategies for improving the lives of people and the prospects of the planet. She has been a minister, special advisor, intellectual leader, troublemaker, SDG advocate-in-chief, and now she is serving at the highest levels of the United Nations. Amina has a rare gift for lasering through chaff and getting to the wheat of every issue and every problem, all of which she is determined to solve. She also knows the SDGs better than perhaps anyone, having led the path-breaking process to forge agreement on the 17 global goals in 2015. I am lucky to call her a dear friend. I always learn from her insights, am challenged by her ambition, and I'm thrilled we have time with her today. So the Deputy Secretary General will offer some initial thoughts, then we'll have a conversation and questions from our audience. And I ask you to please now already start sharing your questions in the chat box. Make sure to identify yourself, where you're from, and we'll get to what we can. So with that, it is my distinct pleasure to turn the floor over to Her Excellency, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Ms. Amina Mohammed. We're having technical difficulties. Please stand by. We'll have Amina Mohammed in just a moment. Keep standing by. We're working on it. Thank you, everyone, for patience and grace while we wait for the Deputy Secretary General. Technology is often our friend, but every now and then it doesn't quite come through, so we're working on it. It's lovely to see you. If only we could all hear you. We'll get there eventually. Thank you to everybody who is multitasking while they wait for the woman of the hour.
Let me call you.
Oh, I've got you now.
Can you
hear
get me?
you?
Okay.
Is the world hearing us?
Oh dear. Yeah, it is. Can you switch that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and for those nice introductory words. I quite like the troublemaker bit. But the one thing that I'm more proud of than anything is mother of 6 and grandmother of 1, and maybe about to be another, because I think that gives the whole picture of all of us once we get into positions of leadership, especially women. But this is an amazing day. Happy UN Charter Day to everyone. It's a day of so many emotions. I've been watching the videos and listening to the voices of all those young people. And it's clearly being this 75-year journey that's been, absolutely momentous. There have been many droughts within that journey, but more often than not, there's been so much that we have to celebrate for. The work that our peacekeepers have done to keep people safe and to prevent losing lives. What our humanitarian workers are doing on the front line, day in, day out. And our development workers that really bring people closer to addressing some of the huge gender issues that we have, water and sanitation, education. So much to celebrate.
And yet in 2020, you and I started January looking at the decade towards achieving the SDGs. And we were planning what we were going to do with the SDG moment in September. And we had also many, I would say this year was a big year for nature. So many things on the way to COP 26 that was going to really tackle climate change. And we were looking at UN at 75. We were looking at the Beijing plus 25. So much energy in January, and then COVID hit pause button, and we were suddenly all reminded of our humanity, of our oneness, of our vulnerabilities, interconnectedness, and it really, what it did, I think, was give that opportunity for reflection, whether we're looking in the mirror or at each other. It was about our global village. And the first thing that happened to us in the UN was, oh my goodness, how can we remain open for business? What is our business continuity plan? And successfully, the UN at 75 remains open, remains engaged as first-line responders in peacekeeping, in the humanitarian work we do. And we've even put development into emergency mode. But as we go into a conversation with the many that you have with us today, I'd like to say, what has come to mind for me has been a number of words, and they mean so much. We've been hearing the words of Maya Angelou, and we always are quoting Madiba Mandela for the things that we do, or Gandhi. But some of the words that came to me as I thought about what am I going to say to Elizabeth and the audience that we have. One, I think, is still that our values in the Charter of We the People matter even more so than they have ever done today. The solidarity that is incumbent upon us when we sign up to the Charter, that we must care about our neighbor, we must do no harm, we must strive until we achieve all the values of the Charter. The fact that today we're thinking about intergenerational, for me that's very powerful because it puts the youth at the center, and I think that's so important. We talk about it often. We want them at the table, but we really actually want them leading. We want them taking that baton as one generation moves to another from 75 years when we were created because of World War II, and where we did not want to see World War III, haven't, but there's a new world out there, and I think COVID tells us that very clearly, and so therefore that whole intergenerational piece, that we have still an unfulfilled promise. Some, the unfinished business of the MDGs, our Millennium Development Goals. Others, the SDGs. We've still got 10 years. They are the promise that we have to live up to. And to do that, we probably need to reimagine our world, to try to lift that and make it happen in everyone's life. And bringing back a sense of our humanity, because when we say everyone, everywhere, it means our humanity. And what has happened with the killing of Floyd, I think, was very sad because it opened up this whole unspoken area of, that our diversity did not mean much in many places, that it was not seen as a richness, that the fabric of this world is rich because of our diversity, yet we are seeing much of it being torn by issues where, Black lives clearly were not mattering and don't matter and need to matter. Integrity, trust, accountability, rights through the eyes of humans, of people, not just through the paper that we write or the resolutions we sign on to, but through we who have these expectations of what our rights are, and mine finish where yours begin. And so that whole world of, respect and dignity, and tolerance, and in a word, sometimes tolerance is not so good because it almost as if you have to. You don't have to. It should be part of our human nature to want to live in a world where we are respectful of one another and that we appreciate the value of each other. Maybe last I would say is leadership. And leadership today is a little strange because the expectations we have of leaders in positions of power that should be leading, really not stepping up to that, not being faithful to the responsibility that opportunity has been given to them. A huge responsibility of millions of people in their countries, in their constituencies. And that, for me, I think is perhaps the most concerning of all, is that as we go forward, how do we reimagine leadership? What are the real expectations and demands we can make of it? How do we make sure that it is in fact you are in fact accountable, and you cannot get off because a piece of paper somewhere says you can abuse that privilege? It's really something that we have to think about very seriously. And so as we speak today, I think we need to bring back the integrity to the UN Charter, to hang on to it even more so than we ever have done, to stop looking the other way. I think the Pope once said it in a very beautiful way when he talked about the globalization of indifference. We must care. We must care about ourselves, our environment, our people, our humanity, our planet. But in the end, it's got to be about our values. And those human values, as I said today, that's what I'm celebrating. And that's what I'm recommitting to as we take a journey, hopefully someone who will carry the baton for another 75 years.
Thank you so much, DSG. I think looking, seeing, listening, acting, the integrity question and values is so fundamental. I'm expecting you to be leading for another 75 years, so don't rule yourself out. I want to ask a few questions to you first, and then we'll turn our questions open to the audience and all of the good ideas and thoughts that are coming in through the chat box. So keep those questions coming. And while those are coming in, let me ask you first. You know, we've heard today and have been thinking so much over this last period about the role and relevance of the Charter. We face a landscape so different from that in 1945. And just in the last few months alone, as you started out by saying, our world has been upended just since January. We heard that from everyone in the videos. And you spend nearly every day talking with leaders from different sectors. So as you do that, and as you look at the changing world, what do you think people around the world, especially young people, should expect from the United Nations?
I think first that we need to be speaking with them, not at them. And the Charter itself, I'm not sure that everyone knows the Charter. And I saw that we were putting out a campaign for it just recently. And I thought that's really something that we need to do. We have the UN, we have the UN around the world in all our offices. We have the Model UN, which is an incredible example of bringing young people together. So I think what we have to do is to be speaking with people and see whether the Charter in fact speaks to them. We take some things for granted. I think it does. I think I've heard voices today about how important the Charter is and the United Nations is. But is that everyone? Because I think in the first 75 years, many people who were not literate, who did not have access, were not connected, and perhaps saw the blue helmets or saw the blue jackets of our humanitarian workers, but never really understood the work beyond that of the United Nations, which is so much more. So I think we need to be speaking with people about the Charter and the importance of those values. And I think that those values, we all need to be grounded in the core values. And I think that that sometimes is a little distant. And so I think that we need to rebirth the United Nations. We need to rebirth it for this generation, because I think even if it was not here today, we would still reinvent it. And so I think it's really important. That rebirthing of the United Nations, for me, at UN at 75 is what we ought to be doing. Much more stakeholder inclusion. As the Secretary General says, we're talking about networked multilateralism, and I'm not sure what that sounds like to young people, but what I would say is that the ownership of the UN beyond we the peoples in the Charter needs to be seen in those who are on the inside of the UN working for the outside.
Well, and I think what we're seeing from all of the consultations going on around the world, the hunger that people have for that kind of engagement and that direct participation in the UN. So those are very good conditions for the kind of renewal and reimagination and rebirth that you're talking about. Let me ask you one other question, and then we'll go to our audience on the phones. So COVID-19 hit us a bare matter of months ago. And as you began your remarks, we're looking at the start of the decade of action on the SDGs. How does that decade look to you now?
Well, I think the first thing that COVID did was to show us how much more urgent the decade was, and how if we had done a little more investment in the first 5 years of the SDGs, we probably would have been better off in coping with COVID around the world, particularly since the health pandemic itself, while it was acting out in the north of our hemisphere, in many developing countries, what hit them first was the socioeconomic impact of COVID. So COVID itself hadn't quite landed, and already they were feeling the impacts of the economic part of this. And so I think that for us, a decade, we see COVID as an opportunity. It is a human crisis, but it's an opportunity to leapfrog because we're saying this matters to everyone everywhere. We have a chance at scale. We have a chance at now focusing on people's budgets through their stimulus packages, filling some of these deficits to say we need to get everything done. So social protection programs, cash transfers. We suddenly found ourselves in lockdown, so no schools. No schools, really? Well, we could put everyone online. And so that whole movement to put people online would really fast track and leapfrog what we would have. We would not be going back to where we were before. Putting businesses online. I saw in Ecuador that we have 100,000 businesses. We migrated from the informal sector onto a digital platform. So, really seeing how we could take profit of the crisis to leapfrog and to strive ahead. I think not to miss that, yes, we have to deal with COVID, but let's not forget the gains that we already have achieved and how we can embed those in the recovering better. The day after COVID is never going to be the same again. It's now that we lay the foundations, sow the seeds for making sure it's better and seeing who's going to be there, doing what, how, when, and where. And this is a time to engage the world and to rethink and reimagine and everything that we're going to do, come post-COVID. But start doing it now.
Great. Well, let me turn to some questions from our audience. I think I know the answer to this first one, but do you believe the UN's future depends on its ability to be inclusive?
Wow, absolutely. I mean, anyone that thinks that it shouldn't, but I think we need to really interrogate inclusive. Sometimes inclusive is seen as representation, and representation ain't inclusive. So I think it's really important to really be clear to everybody what inclusivity means. And that's why I said to you, the ownership of the UN needs to be rethought. Yes, it's member states, and member states have a huge responsibility. But today we are in a connected world where stakeholders are as important in lifting many of the promises that we've made. They are the partners of government. So be they mayors or parliaments or civil society or business, these people and constituencies need to find a place in that inclusivity. We've always worked for the most vulnerable, but today vulnerable is being classified differently because we can't just have a country that is a low-income country and say vulnerability. We could have a high-income country in the islands that we have, and just overnight with a hurricane, everyone becomes vulnerable. So I think we need to look at vulnerability. We need to look to see how everyone is included in the narrative, the promise, and the roadmaps and charter that we have to make sure we don't leave anyone behind. It's when we crafted that Leave No One Behind, it was because we wanted each and every one of you to really think about those words. So who are the no ones in your constituency, in your country, in the work that you do? And you look for them when they're not around the table and bring them to the table, bring them to the party.
And it wasn't just a tagline, it was a serious commitment.
Very serious. I know many people who didn't like it. I have to tell you, we struggled for that tagline. You were part of that.
I remember.
And I think, everyone owns it because it has meaning. It really does have meaning. When people get stuck over words of some of the resolutions that we have, which are really tough because 193 people at the table, it's hard to find consensus with ambition. But I think we did that with the SDGs, and it was inclusive. People see themselves in the 17 goals and their meaning and their promise.
Here's another question. What are member states or the UN doing to really make the UN fit for purpose for the future?
Another one, fit for purpose.
An easy question.
Too. Yes, no, well, I mean, since Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General, came on, his vision was to do exactly that, to make the UN more fit for purpose in providing better peacekeeping, humanitarian services where we would see the exit to crisis, and so therefore focus more on prevention, look at the transitions, and more especially use the 2030 agenda as the roadmap out of these conflicts into sustainable development. So first on his deck was the reforms. And the word reform sounds, pretty boring and awful and process. But what it has done, it's transformed us. At least from development, what we're doing here is to take much more the decision-making and the actions closer to where they matter, near the people. And so for us, the resident coordinators we have in 131 countries are people who are commanding the expertise and the footprint of the UN in those countries and beyond to try to support communities, governments, business, in doing what we need to do to deliver the SDGs. So what we're doing to be fit for purpose is about transforming our mindsets, the way in which we do our work, the way in which we partner, the way in which perhaps we look differently. Today, sadly, we see huge increases in gender-based violence. And that, for one, across the world. So what are the tools that we are using? And in my really interesting conversations yesterday with people in New York, our host city, just to see how they manage to take everything online and succeed in continuing to protect women. But here, I think that, taking it right down to the local level where we have tailor-made responses, that's what our transformation has been about. We still have a way to go. And I hope, as I said to you earlier, that perhaps that way to go will be more inspiring, more responsive, and more transformational when we see our stakeholders on the inside helping us to do that.
So one more question. What more can member states do to give meaningful engagement for the world's young people in the work of the United Nations, especially given that this is the largest youth population we have in the world at the moment? And if you want to wrap that into final reflections, feel free to do so.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, I mean, young people are central to this, and there are many ways of bringing them to the table, and I think that member states have made some effort to do that. It's insufficient. I think they have to be part of shaping decisions and leading, and I think that we need to see that in the work we do in missions. In New York and around the world, we do see some young people as our experts, but we need to see them doing more than just the expert work, actually getting into the place of leadership. So that's preparing them for what is there over the next few decades. I think that we have to do this both at country level and in every institution that we work and we are represented, is to see more young people at the center of things. We have policies, we have plans, we have to enact them, operationalize them, fund them. I think that's what we need to see from member states. Today, in my final reflections, I would say we needed a global response to this pandemic. It's happening to everyone everywhere, and no one is going to be safe unless we deal with it everywhere. But I think the response has fallen short of the urgency and of the scale that we need. Too many people, too many countries, too many leaders are looking inwards. And you can look inwards, suffice to put the oxygen mask on your face, and then you have to reach out and you have to help everyone else, because that's what our global village is about. What we haven't seen is that happening in a manner at the scale and with the urgency that it needs. So I still say that we're missing the solidarity. We're talking about it. We have to now act on it. We've seen many protests where people have gone to the street in solidarity with racism. And I think now we need to see solidarity with peace, with prosperity, with the root causes that cause the instabilities we see so much in our world today. And so, for me, the next 75 years, and I hope it will be shorter, I would like to see the sprint in the decades to the 2030 agenda really see meaningful work transitioning out of conflict and crises into sustainable development, peace, and that deep respect for human rights, for which the Charter itself holds at its center.
Well, thank you so much. It is such a privilege, Deputy Secretary General, and I thank you for your reflections today. And we all thank you for your conviction, your vision, and your unrelenting determination to use your time at the UN and in life with such purpose. Let me also thank everyone else who contributed today such rich insights. And I just want to offer one brief closing reflection. Some of you are familiar with the emergency broadcast system that we use in different countries when there's a crisis. They're often tested, and we hear on our phones and our radios, this is just a test. I think we all know that 2020 is not just a test. It's testing us, Our institutions, our systems, our leaders, our habits, our ability to show solidarity for our neighbors. All of us as ordinary people trying to do the right thing in our communities, in our countries. And we've been tested before. In 1945, we rose to that challenge. In 2020, we need to decide whether we can rise again and who we want to be. If we will choose unity instead of division, partners instead of partisans, common ground instead of narrow corners. In response to COVID-19 alone, we have all seen such ingenuity, bravery, the grace of ordinary people everywhere who get that we're in this together and they are prepared to stand up for each other. You know, the Charter of the United Nations, as we've heard throughout this morning, was drafted by governments, but it invoked we the peoples. And the Secretary General has called for an inclusive multilateralism, a transformation of global governance, and a future built on solidarity and unity. That is a call I hope everyone listening will take to heart. Eddie earlier reminded us of Maya Angelou's beautiful poem on the 50th anniversary, A Brave and Startling Truth. And if you bear with me, I want to read it again. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible. We are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it. I want to thank again His Excellency President Mohammed Bande, President of the 74th session of the General Assembly, for convening this special event. To our many distinguished speakers and all